Seamus Heaney's Out of the Bag is a complex poem, and probably by one of the most celebrated poets in the collection. Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet, and came from a very humble background, the eldest of 9 children. His father and grandfather were tenant farmers, and he was a child prodigy. This was noticed early in his life by his teacher, his parents, the local vicar, and the doctor mentioned in the poem, who was a real person. He was encouraged to study and eventually ended up at Oxford and won a number of prizes. So a very, very well-known poet, a really, really accomplished poet, and we'll see a lot of complex techniques in the poem. And as with all of the poems of the decade, there will be no time in the exam to write about all of the techniques in the poem. And this poem is jam-packed with things that you could write about. And what you need to do is cherry-pick the techniques that you need to back up your argument. Now, this poem, I think, is very much about memory, and to an extent childhood, but it really focuses in on the power of memory and the power of imagination. He presents us memories that kind of nest inside one another, like a Russian doll, a memory inside a memory inside a memory, and some of the way he uses language also reflects that. The main conceit of the poem is expressed in the first line. All of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. And I'm sure you've worked out that this rather humorous first line is about the fact that, as the eldest child of 9, Heaney would have watched the doctor come and deliver his mum's babies at home in the 1930s and 40s at the time of writing. And because the doctor arrived with a big doctor's bag, which was closed, and then left again, and with the bag seeming empty, the children in the family, who didn't understand where babies came from, thought that the baby had brought the doctor in his bag and left it behind. So if I show you a picture of this kind of bag, you'll recognise what I mean. So a really big bag like this. And he talks in one of the early stanzas about it being unsnibbed. This part of the bag is the snib, the catch, where you kind of click it open to open the bag. Then there's kind of a metal framework here which holds the bag open so it's solid, with all of the instruments inside, which are fascinating to the little boy who watches the doctor come and go. So it's very much about childhood, about memory, and about imagination. And the poem is really long, written in 4 parts. And I'm going to recommend to you that you focus on the first part and perhaps mention the 4th part in passing. The 2nd and 3rd parts, you need to know what happens in them, which I'll explain in a minute so you can understand the full poem. But I'm going to suggest that you focus any writing that you do on the first part of the poem, because there's plenty of devices there for you to write about that link to the human condition, or to memory, or to imagination, and you don't really need to worry too much about the 2nd and 3rd parts of the poem. So in the first part of the poem, the doctor visits, delivers a baby. The little boy, Seamus, is fascinated by the instruments that he has and what he does, and then the doctor goes off again, having left a baby behind. In the second part of the poet presents us with a different memory, in which he remembers being in a place called Epidavros in Greece. Now, you would go to Epidavros in ancient times and in modern times if you wanted to be close to God, because the ancient Greeks believed that the slightly toxic volcanic fumes that came out of the ground there quite naturally could give you visions of God if you inhaled them. And Heaney visited there as a tourist and actually had an experience of feeling quite sleepy and as if he were hallucinating having been there. The fact that he hallucinates after inhaling some fumes triggers another memory for him when he was a child in a Catholic procession at a place called Lourdes in France. And Lourdes is a holy place to Catholics. People report to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary there. So again, it's the idea that within this memory, you can feel a kind of closeness to God. And this all links together because he's exploring how one memory can trigger another. And he's also exploring how poetry can link to healing and medicine, because in ancient Greek, poets and doctors tended to be the same person with two roles, and also links to his own personal history. You know, he's wondering whether he should have stuck more closely to his Catholic roots. He's wondering whether he should have become a farmer like his father and grandfather before him. And he's kind of musing on his childhood fascination with the Doctor, who was someone who inspired him. But the main part of the poem that we want to focus on is part 1, and then we'll have a look at part 4. I'm going to read some little bits of it to you so that you can hear some of the rhythm. So, all of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. He'd arrive with it, disappear to the room, and by the time he'd reappear to wash those nosy, rosy, big soft hands of his in the scullery basin, its lines inside, the colour of a spaniel's inside lug, were empty for all to see, the trap-sprung mouth unsnibbed and gaping wide. Then, like a hypnotist unwinding us, he'd wind the instruments back into their lining, tie the cloth like an apron round itself, darken the door, and leave with the bag in his hand, a plump arc by the keel. Until the next time came, and in he'd come in his fur-lined collar that was also spaniel-covered, and go stooping up to the room again, a whiff of disinfectant, a Dutch interior gleam of waistcoat satin and highlight on the forceps. Getting the water ready, that was next. Not plumping hot, not lukewarm, but soft, sud-luscious, saved to him from the rain butt, and savoured by him afterwards, all thanks denied, as he towelled hard and fast. So I'll stop there for a moment and we'll have a look at some of the devices so far. Now, you'll notice that the poem is written in 3-line stanzas, which are called tercets. And with any device, it's all very well being able to spot it and to give it the correct name, but we need to think about how that links to meaning. So we always say to ourselves, well, what aspect of being human is this poem about? As I've said, it's about childhood memory, it's about imagination, and it's about the kind of conflict between the realistic parts of your life, the mundane, physical parts of your life, and the spiritual parts. So those 3 lines, that pattern of 3, could perhaps link to past, present, and future, and that's mirrored in that 3 lines. It could also link to Heaney, his mum, the Doctor. You've got 3 people involved there, haven't you? But it could also have a link to the Holy Spirit, couldn't it? The idea of God, the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that kind of holy trio there. So there are a number of ways that the tercet form mirror the patterns in the poem. And also notice that at first most of it's written in iambic pentameter. So you've got 5 pairs of iambs. I've written that over for you here. So that's a pair of syllables where the stress is on the second syllable. So didum, titum. So all of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. Now you wouldn't really read it out like that, would you? And the stress is on the second syllable because that's the important part of the word. All of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. And the reason why iambic pentameters have been chosen here, firstly, is to stress the importance of poetry to Heaney. He is an accomplished poet. Although this is a memory, and if you read it through without thinking about the devices too much, it comes out rather as a stream of consciousness with this little boy kind of burbling about how exciting it is when the Doctor comes and delivers a baby. He's still able to control that meter. So he's showing us his poetic skill and emphasising the importance of that control. But secondly, iambic pentameters are used because they're the closest meter to natural human speech. So this is like Heaney talking to you. And the whole mode of the poem feels like direct address, doesn't it? I'll write that up here for you. It feels like he's telling you an anecdote about his childhood. So there's a real opportunity for engagement there with the reader. He also extensively uses enjambment, so where the sense of the line runs into the next line. He'd arrive with it, disappear to the room, and by the time he'd reappear to wash those nosy, rosy, big soft hands of his in the scullery basin. So you can hear there when you try to read it out, almost getting out of breath because there's so many words. The lines enjam into each other, the stanzas enjam into each other, and there's this great sense of excitement and pace because of that. But Heaney is really clever because he combines this with caesura. So you get all this long enjam section, and then suddenly, unsnibbed and gaping wide, caesura, a big forced stop there in the middle of the line with that full stop. And then the poem starts again. Then, like a hypnotist unwinding us, he'd wind the instruments back into their lining. So there's ever such a lot going on there, so I'll explain it a bit by bit. First of all, here the meter changes. So rather than an I am, you've now got a trochee where the rhythm reverses. So I ams go ti-tum, trochees go tum-ti. And you've got that reversal because it mirrors what he's saying in the poem. In this part, he's unpacked all his instruments and gone upstairs and helped Mum. Here, he's finished. You get the caesura, the baby's born, and he winds everything back up again and puts it back into his bag. So you've got that sense of reversal, and that's mirrored in the meter. And again, Heaney's really showing us his expertise. He's at the top of his game in this poem. You know, he's the master. It's so controlled. And that mirrors, of course, the control that the doctors have. Look here, he uses this simile to describe the doctor as being like a hypnotist. The children were so amazed by what the doctor could do. It's almost like they had been hypnotized by him. And he uses his hands to kind of wind them in like hypnotist was, and then wind the instruments back up as well. You've got the personification as well of the bag, of it sitting there almost like a beast waiting to eat them up, or the baby. You've got this wonderful description of the lining inside the bag being the colour of a spaniel's inside lug. Now, a lug is a colloquial word for an ear. So you've got that wonderful childhood language there of the inside of the doctor's bag is the same colour as the inside of our dog's ear. A wonderful frame of reference that children have where they relate things to things that they know. And all the way through, if you noticed, the child, Heaney, who's watching this doctor, is fascinated by the clothing that the doctor has, the fur-lined collar, the waistcoat satin. And then over the page he talks about the his coat as well. So he's quite fascinated by, in his mind, the riches that the doctor has with his clothing. When the doctor leaves, he's holding the bag at the end, a plump ark by the keel. Now we've got that metaphor here to express the idea that the doctor's bag to the little boy is almost like a kind of cradle of life. Like an ark, somewhere where life is preserved. So he's making a comparison there, isn't he, to Noah's Ark, which, according to the Bible, saved the human race when the world was being destroyed by God. So there's a real sense that he associates the doctor with life and creation. When the doctor comes back again, and we've got another enjambment and caesura combination here using this ellipses, and then he goes again saying, and the doctor came back again when the next baby arrived. We've got a real sense of awe that the little boy feels. He talks about how the doctor stoops up to the room again. The doctor is tall, so he has to bend when he's climbing the stairs. And just for a second, the little boy, Heaney, gets to peep into the room. He just gets a tiny smell of disinfectant and a little glimpse of what's going on inside. And what he sees, he describes as a Dutch interior gleam. Now, this is another metaphor. in which he's comparing what he can see in Mum's bedroom to a Dutch interior painting. Now, these are paintings from the 17th century, which, if you Google them, are very dark to look at, and they tend to depict flowers and kind of displays of food. And they are designed to showcase the poet's ability to use light. So you get metal plates or fruits or flowers with little gleams of light on them. So he's just seen something glinting in the room. We're starting to build here a sense of ritual, aren't we? The equipment that the Doctor has are all mystical and ritual. It's rather like when he, later in the poem, is at Lord's and he's holding the thoroughfare, the incense holder. He is associating ritual with the Doctor does. It's almost a holy experience. Then we get an end stop here, highlights on the forceps, which is an instrument used to deliver babies. And that stops the little boy from imagining, because that's quite brutal, a forceps delivery. So he's suddenly brought back to the real world, and he remembers getting the water ready. That was next. So his job as the eldest child is to prepare some hot water for the Doctor to wash his hands in. Really important, really necessary, but also probably a distraction that his parents have put in place so that he won't worry about what's happening to Mum while the Doctor's in there with him. So he goes off to get some water from the rain butt. So rain butt's a barrel that you collect rainwater in, and that would be have less lime scale in it, so it would lather better than water from a well. They wouldn't have had running water in the cottage, I shouldn't have thought, at this stage. Look at the description of it though. Soft, sudluscious, saved for him. So you notice there that there's that repeated S sound, the sibilance. And in one way it mirrors the kind of luxurious feel of the soapy water. But we always say, don't we, that sibilance creates a sense of unease. And I think this little boy is both in awe of the Doctor, but also a little bit afraid of him. And notice what the Doctor does now. All thanks denied, as he towelled hard and fast. So the little boy is trying to thank him, or someone in the family is trying to thank him. And this would have been pro bono work. Heaney is reminding us that his family lived in a time when healthcare wasn't free. You would have to pay for it. His family wouldn't have been able to afford to pay for it. So this lovely community doctor is coming to help Mum deliver her baby free of charge, out of goodness, and that's called pro bono. Suddenly, he sticks his arms out behind him, the Doctor, and again, this is another little moment of the poem that's almost comic, because he doesn't speak, he doesn't say anything. And if you can imagine kind of a reverse Superman where he just sticks his arms out behind him, and the reason why is he wants to be squired and silk-lined into the camel coat. Now, a squire is the assistant to a knight. So many years ago, when you had knights who were the protectors of the king or queen, they would have a young boy assistant, a squire, who would help them into their equipment and out. And they were also training to be knights. So there's a sense here of that the boy is in awe of the Doctor, and also that he wants to be like him. He's someone in training to be a professional like the Doctor. And again, we've got this obsession with the riches of the coat. Camel's got nothing to do with the animal camel, it's just that kind of light beige colour that these kind of coats were. At which point he wants, so notice that use of the preposition there to emphasise that the Doctor only really looked at young Seamus just once. There's a distance between them because of the Doctor's status. And when he looked at him, his eyes were Hyperborean and beyond the north wind blue. So Heaney doubly emphasises there that he feels that the Doctor comes from the very, very north. That's what Hyperborean means, from the very north and beyond the north wind blue. So it's almost like he's saying that the Doctor comes from the Arctic, the very top of the world, which is probably the most distant, strange place that the little boy can think of, but also very cold, which goes with the Doctor's slightly distant air. When he looks at the doctor's eyes, and notice we've got that enjambment back again here because the little boy's getting really excited. He sees the eyes, and this is a metaphor, as two peepholes that he looks through. So if you've got one of those peepholes in your front door at home that you can look out to the outside world, this is that in reverse. He's imagining that when he looks into the doctor's eyes, he sees the room that the doctor works in most of the time, his surgery or his laboratory. And he starts to list the things that he sees. So in this list, he talks about how the doctor's workplace is milky white, cold, very clean, the porcelain is swabbed, cold white tiles, so he kind of repeats it to emphasize the purity, the coldness of where the doctor comes from. And then he starts to list things that are purely from the imagination. He imagines that the doctor has steel hooks, chrome surgery tools, and blood dreeps in the sawdust. Now, dreeps is a lovely compound word that Heaney has made up, I think. It's a combination of drip and seep. And he's saying that there is sawdust on the floor to catch blood. Now, many, many years ago, surgeons would have had rooms like that, but not in the time that Dr. Curlin's working. And I think the little boy Heaney is muddling up butcher shops, which then would have hung the carcasses of animals up on hooks and the blood would have drained out of them onto the floor. He's muddling that up with the doctor's surgery because he's a bit scared of the doctor. And then we get another caesura, and the little boy's really gone off now on a flight of fancy because he starts to describe something purely from his imagination, which is really very funny. And he imagines that the doctor's got a washing line kind of hanging up in the top of the surgery, and on that washing line are little parts of babies, because in his imagination the doctor makes babies out of spare parts. That's how he comes to deliver them to their cottage. A little pendant that just means hanging down, teat-hued, so the colour of skin, infant parts strung neatly up from a line near the ceiling, a toe, a foot, a shin, an arm, a cock. Now, a cock is a colloquial word for a penis, and he obsesses about this for a minute. He puts it at the end of his list, which is so funny because it's just what a little boy would do, and obsess about the rude bits, if you like. And he compares the tiny penis that he's imagining to a rosebud in the doctor's buttonhole, because a baby's little penis and a rosebud are a similar shape. So this bit is all about imagination and wondering about where does life come from. But I love the kind of childish misunderstanding and the humour in there. Okay, then we move on to the second and third parts, which, as I said, we don't really need to worry about too much. There's just a couple of bits that I've highlighted to remind you that at Epidavros, when he goes on holiday or as a pilgrim, he feels that he's having some kind of closer connection of God by being there. And Epidavros is associated with the poet doctors, these doctors who also use poetry as a cure. And it's almost like he's trying to work out whether his profession as a poet is as valuable as that as a doctor or a farmer. He talks about how this triggers another memory of fainting when he was at Lourdes. And when he fainted, during his unconscious state, he had a memory of Dr. Curlin standing at his kitchen window. It's not a memory, rather it's an imagined memory, a hallucination, because he's imagining the doctor drawing on the cottage window kind of rude pictures of naked ladies, and also as he washes his hands he's imagining the doctor pulling the baby parts together, again with this enjambment and this use of trochees to suggest that the meter has changed, the emphasis has changed. So he really cleverly uses that reversal in meter to show us that he's moving between description of the real and description of the imagined. He talks about in the third part how he even engaged in the ritual by sending grass from Epidavros to someone he knew who was having cancer treatment. And again, that's really just relevant to us because it's thinking about the connection between our real lives and our spiritual lives and our imagination. In the final part of the poem, we are brought to the present, really. It seems that Heaney is talking to us now, but he's standing in the room where Mum was when all these babies were born. And he has another memory of Mum being there with the baby being born, or lying in the bed when she was dying. And it is ambiguous, we're not quite sure. My gut feeling is sorry, I'll spell that right, it's because I'm talking at the same time. That's a U, ambiguous. He's there with his mum as she's dying in the same bed that she delivered all of her babies, and notice that she has the same special sheets on that were there at her wedding, there when her babies were being born, and when people are dying, these sheets are put on the bed because they're special. He stands there with her as she comes and goes in and out of consciousness, which links to the part 3 of the poem, doesn't it, where he's hallucinating. And the poem ends with dialogue and this question between mother and son. What do you think of the new wee baby the doctor brought for us all when I was asleep? So the mum kind of colludes with this myth that the doctor has brought the baby in with his bag. So the poem ends with this reassertion of magic, the idea that the baby has arrived in that magical manner in the doctor's bag. Okay, so I would focus on the first part of the poem. There's, if you Google analysis of the poem, you'll find that every line has got about 3 devices in it. If we're going to link it to something similar, probably the things that you need are in that first part of the poem. Think about the meter and the way he uses these vivid images from a childhood's imagination, and the lovely kind of childish humour in the poem to express that sometimes children get a bit muddled up.